Kaya Wanju to everyone in this room, and also particularly to those joining us via live stream today. For those of you who aren't familiar with WA's Noongar language, Kaya Wanju is hello and welcome. So hello and welcome to today's event, Growing Minds, Growing Economy. I told our lunch crowd here that I think this is a wonderful sentiment. Today, more than ever, we need to grow our economy and we need to grow our minds. The dreadful nonsense we hear about vaccines and why it's smart to wait to get one beggars belief. So if ever there was a case for growing minds early, that's one right there. So as I told our group, I am double jabbed with AstraZeneca and I live to tell the tale, and I hope you are all vaccinated too. I'm Diane Smith-Gander, the National Chair of CEDA, and your host for today's discussion. We meet on Wajak Noongar Budja here in Perth. Let me pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded by traditional owners, and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which all of our audience is meeting today. I'm very passionate about a voice for our Indigenous people. I think it is critical to Australia evolving as a nation. Effective reconciliation is also a part of growing minds and growing economy. We're looking forward to a great discussion today. We've got lots of options for you to join in. You can follow CEDA on Twitter, that would be at CEDA_news, and then join today's conversation using the hashtag Childcare, all in caps. Along those digital lines, CEDA also uses the Pigeonhole app to allow wide participation in our discussion. So you can access that at ceda.pigeonhole.at, and the password is also childcare. You can enter your own questions there. You can view other people's questions, and I'm very pleased to note we already have one good one. So let's have a few more, please. When you vote on them, I'll be using that voting to work out which questions to pose to our panel. So I'm very much looking forward to this topic. You know, education is very much a family interest for me. I grew up in the south of Perth. It was a new suburb and there wasn't a lot of infrastructure. Mum was a stay-at-home mum and Dad was a boilermaker. Later they both became educators, but their passion for education was evident when they lobbied, they fundraised, and then they were actively involved in the construction of a kindergarten on some council land that was just opposite our home. My younger brother attended that kindergarten. It didn't get constructed in time for me, although I do remember some very early and highly unsuccessful ballet classes in that room. Better I moved on to basketball, much more appropriate for my height. My mum and dad would be absolutely gobsmacked at the facilities available today. In our audience, we have Dr. Marie Perry of Methodist Ladies College. She would show them the early learning centre at the college. And the facilities that are there for growing young minds are just amazing. So great facilities here in Perth, but just not enough of them. We all need to get my mum and dad's passion for early childhood education. And of course, you all know me as an advocate for gender equity. And how could we talk about childcare without talking about gender equity? Because of course, everything to do with children has a gender angle. Childcare and early childhood education are really seen as very much women's work, a woman's issue. And of course, anything that has the potential to grow our economy by increasing labour force participation, to improve productivity by using all of the available talent, and to give everyone a great start in life, that should be all of our concern, not just women. So I'm really delighted that the Honourable Weatherill AO, CEO of Thrive by 5 at the Minderoo Foundation, is here to join us and give us his thoughts on how we can all engage with this particular problem. Born in South Australia, educated in South Australia, he does have an economics degree, that's great, law degree as well, we won't think about that too much. And once, of course, he was Premier of the state, but he's now resident in Perth, south of the river, just like me, and doing something completely different. Or is it? Casual examination of some of the things you did when you were Premier show a lot of forward thinking, a lot of real activism for inclusion, you know, a lot of work about LGBTIQ inclusion, reform of energy policy, even thinking about nuclear. So we really want now to get the inside skinny from you about what it's like being here, being CEO for Thrive for 5. What's it all about? What are you trying to do? Give us a story.
Well, in a way, it started back when I first became a minister. One of the early ministries I had were children's portfolios of different sorts. So it was child protection at one stage and early childhood development. But really, probably the thing that really switched me onto this agenda was a couple of thinkers in residence that we had in South Australia. It was a program we ran where we brought thinkers from around the world and they got to inform us. And two of them made a massive impression on me. The first was a fellow called Dr. Fraser Mustard, who I understand also visited Western Australia as part of his residency in South Australia. And he switched us on to the brain story, the brain story that little Molly was so beautifully told a moment ago on the TED Talk. This idea that 1 million neural connections occur every second with high quality interactions, and that we're born with this sort of forest of neurons that basically, they're an endowment, but they only operate once they're sort of switched on, and they're switched on through interactions. And that to me just seemed like a massive world of possibility. The idea that the whole of your trajectory could be established through the quality of the interactions that you have in those early years. And so that was one really powerful influence. And then the other was a woman called Carla Rinaldi from the Reggio Emilia School. And she switched me on to this whole idea of the child having rights, and we need to reimagine how we saw children rather than as just being weak, needy subjects, that they're ready to learn right from the start, full of possibility. So those two people really switched this on. It's stayed with me ever since. And I suppose for me, getting involved in politics was about trying to change the world for the better. And immediately I was now given this formula about how you could best do that. Investing in the early years was going to make so much of a difference on all those things I wanted to change about the world.
So you've got the formula, you've had this interaction in South Australia, the Premier. Okay, so how do you then walk to Minderoo? What happens next?
Well, partly, I tried, of course, to do some of these things when I was in the job and also as Premier, and the problem with national politics is that you can put something on the agenda by Premier, being a Premier, you're sort of obliged to put whatever it is you want to advance on the agenda, but keeping it there is very hard, especially when you've got other large, powerful interests and issues at play. So when the idea of actually coming to West Australia to actually involve myself in a foundation that was well-resourced, that has its objective early childhood, and I thought I could pick up almost where I left off to achieve some of the things I was unable to achieve in office. It was just such an exciting possibility. To run the sort of campaign I would have loved to have run as Premier, but of course you've got other things to do as Premier. So that was so tantalising, and that's why I'm here. Yeah.
So tell me what it is that Thrive by 5 actually does. What's the day job look like? Yeah, so, well, it's got a long history. So Nicola and Andrew Forrest, 20 years ago, established a thing called the Australian Children's Trust. So they did that when they didn't have very much money, but they were committed to philanthropy. And then, of course, they got a lot of money. And then they put it into a much bigger foundation called Minderoo. But it always had this continuing commitment to early childhood. And so separated out for one of the 10 initiatives is Thrive by 5. And it's all about early childhood development. So it started off really in lots of partnerships with Chalice School up there in Armidale, with Telethon Kids Institute, doing a range of things, and publishing thought leadership pieces, evidence papers. But what I tried to persuade them of is that that's all fine, you can have a good argument, but if you really want to get change, you have to move the political process. To move the political process, you need a campaign. To create a campaign, you need a campaign goal, and you need partners. And so that's what we're doing. We're really campaigning for a universal high-quality early learning system for the nation, and we're joining with people around the nation to make that true. What excites you the most about this notion of having a universal system?
Well, it's just, like if you see a little baby and you just, it's impossible not to think about that there's possibility for the future. Every new child that comes into the world is unique. And the idea of being able to switch on their capability to be the very best they can be, there's something incredibly optimistic about that. There's always hope for the future when you see a little child. So fundamentally, that's the thing that excites me the most. But it, and all the things you worry about, whether it's homelessness, chronic disease, the juvenile justice system, just the misery of broken relationships, all those things, that we spend so much in organisations that are represented in this room and beyond, that spend so much of their time and effort trying to grapple with. That if you were able to actually invest early and actually change the trajectory of the children's lives, you could do so much more. And we know that investing early just gives you such a great return. So fixing those problems up later, it costs you 10 times as much as if you got in early. So it just makes so much sense at so many levels to actually get that change. Yeah.
That's a really interesting dynamic for me, that notion of the stitch in time that saves 9. So we spend $1 today to avoid spending $10 going forward in the future. But it's very hard to move money from programs that are at the back end to money, into the front end. How do you think about that dynamic? Got any big ideas there? Well,
first, it's important to measure it, and Minderoo did a bit of that. They said at $15.2 billion is the price tag conservatively for the cost of late intervention. So you need to sort of put the case. So when people, there's only one argument that's ever advanced about what I'm talking about, and that is it costs too much. The answer is, well, we're already paying the bill. We're already paying the bill and fixing up the sort of broken lives. So, but of course, that bill is paid over a longer period, and turning it around will take some time. So it is a long-term return. There's no doubt about that. But I think, I just wonder whether the pandemic and the fact that we've all been through this quite, epoch-changing experience might make us think about the future a bit more. Maybe there's an appetite for big systems changes that actually do give you long rates of return, but they're there. I mean, all the evidence suggests that they're there. It's just that they're not. You won't see them in the first 3 years of the forward estimates. They'll be well beyond that.
And so how do you overcome that dynamic then? Do you really think you're better placed, in a foundation like Minderoo to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think I am actually, because, in government it's just, look, politicians, all they can do is really deal with plus or minus 10% of what the popular mood is. They can, a rare politician will lead and get way ahead of public opinion, but that can be courageous in the yes minister language. More likely, what they can do is shape the tides that are occurring in the broader community. And so if you're outside of government, you can actually create the pressure for change, which actually means the politicians can actually ride those waves and turn them into something. Now, there's an important job to be done for politicians to actually articulate the movement for change and to actually then design policies that meet those needs. But we can, when in the broader community, we can create the pressure for change and frankly create, a penalty, a political penalty if people don't meet those needs. So what we're trying to do is to campaign so that at the next federal election, there are choices between parties, and hopefully, the ideal result is they all adopt our policies and we win no matter who forms the government. But what we want to do is to show people that there's popular support for these measures, and they should choose these. Otherwise, parties with a relatively better policy will rank them more highly, and people will make their own choices about who they vote for.
And this is very much a game of federal change,
at the moment,
right?
Because that's the game in town. It's a federal election. But, each of the states and territories have big roles to play in early childhood development, and so we'll turn our attention to them next.
Well, that's something they can all very much look forward to, I'm sure. Do you ever sort of think, gee, it'd be nice to be a state premier again just at the moment, given we saw, recently, now absent all of the very disappointing changes in New South Wales. It's sad when a politician ends their career in that way, I'm sure you'd agree. But, you know, I saw the power issue in the AFR, and there we are with, you know, the premiers knocking the Prime Minister off that perch. Any regrets?
For about 30 seconds, and then you realise the life of Daniel Andrews. I mean, I did have a twinge. You think, oh, it'd be great to be in the driver's seat in the middle of such a big national crisis. But but imagine their lives. You know, very little sleep, day after day of having to front the media. You look at the personal toll it's taken. I think it wrapped up in the New South Wales result is I think, pressure associated with COVID. You look at Daniel Andrews. All right, he slipped down some stairs, but, you know, I'm sure he had a few other things on his mind at the time. I just think it's been really tough, and I don't think this current crop of politicians have been through. None of the rest of us have ever had the experience, and of course they've generally done a good job, and that's why now you're seeing state premiers being elevated as sort of national political figures, which is an interesting dynamic for the next federal election.
Indeed. Has that meant that you've had to sort of pivot your approach at all in terms of the way you're thinking about, you know, the changes you want to have? Has COVID had that sort of impact on the workings of Thrive by 5?
In the sense that, I mean, COVID has, in a sense, put the early years agenda, or early years on the national political agenda, because what it's revealed is the fragility of the early years service system. So that, and we quickly jumped on that and tried to make that, we tried to make the most of that. And I think it's had that other effect that I mentioned before, is that it's made people say, well, you know, what does the future look like? This is a really big change. Do we need big ideas to respond to big challenges? And so I think it's given permission to be bold, public in policy sense. So there's some of the things that we've tried to use the pandemic to shape our ambitions.
You said something really interesting there, you know, the fragility. Use that particular word. And I think we've seen a number of things that perhaps we took for granted in some ways during the pandemic that have proved to be a lot more fragile than we thought. So talk to me a little bit about that fragility comment.
Well, I mean, if you compare it, say, with the school system or the health system, they have been under enormous pressure also during the pandemic, yet they've largely emerged unscathed. There haven't been threats of schools closing or hospitals closing. There's certainly been pressure on those institutions. Whereas in the childcare sector, you've seen them fall over or at threat of falling over. And there's real challenges to the viability of those that sector, and it's largely because it's the way it's funded, and it's not really seen as a system in the same way as the education system is. So what we really need at its heart is something from birth to 5, which is a coherent service system, and that's what we're really campaigning for. It's going to be a complex system because you've got the needs of infants, toddlers, preschoolers are different, but at the moment it's a mess in those early years. There's big gaps, quality issues, and a whole range of things that mean that families and children don't get what they need.
And we talked before about the difficulty of taking money away and, you know, redirecting it. And you've got already this system, fragile as you've just outlined it. So is the biggest challenge that you've got sort of thinking about how to retool and redesign that system and move from where we are at the minute? Well,
I suppose the way we've approached it is first you've got to create the burning platform, the why. Why are we doing this? And we've got there are 4 main reasons we advance. One is the story Molly just told about the way children's brains develop. The second story is about cost of living pressures on young families. A third is female economic participation, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. And the fourth is this broad question about it being good for the economy. So we create the case for change, the fact that the system at the moment doesn't address those questions. And then we seek to advance our solutions. But we're very much in that model of still we haven't necessarily broken through with the idea that this is a problem that belongs at the top of the national political agenda. And there's a sort of a truism about national politics, which is there's a hierarchy. There's sort of national security, there's economic security, and then you start cascading down into other issues. And things like education and social issues are a long way down the list, and they tend to be regarded as states issues. So somehow we've also got to turn this into a national economic issue, and that's been part of the reason we've advanced it in this way. If you want it on the national agenda, you have to be talking about economics.
Okay. Look, we're starting to get some good questions in. Is there anything you want to just say that I haven't given you an opportunity to talk about so far?
Well, I think I'm sure we'll touch on later the female workforce participation question, but one of the other pieces of background music, I think, to this campaign, which has surprised us in its potency, has been the gender question, the way gender equity is played into this debate. And there's lots of different potential explanations for that, but I think many women are finding their voice in this debate, and they see the question of arrangements for children in the early years as part and parcel of not just the well-being of their children, but also their ability to participate in work and community life. And that dynamic has been voiced by some very powerful and articulate women, and is sort of morphed into a slightly, it's a related debate, but the debate that we're hearing through Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins about essentially respect for women. So there's a big gender issue that sits behind all of this, and I think will be a big dynamic in the lead up to the next federal election. So our campaign obviously seeks to link with that energy that seems to be emerging in the community.
So I think what I hear you say, to paraphrase, is that the time is now.
Basically.
Yeah.
I think the surf is up on this issue. A lot of people in this room will have been campaigning on early years reform, and they'll be saying exactly the same things I've been saying. But it's not always good arguments find their time, and when you do find that moment, you've got to capitalise on it, because there's no natural reason why the early years should be on the national political agenda. It is at the moment, and we've got to keep it there and prosecute that case.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our panel to join us now. So while they're coming up to the stage, I'd also like to note that we have Elizabeth Hill with us, who is an Associate Professor at the University of Sydney, and she's joining us, technology willing. You always sort of have to say that, but I think it looks like we're in good shape. Elizabeth, can you hear us?
I can hear you very clearly, Diane.
Excellent. And also Professor Gervase Chaney, who is the National Chair of Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, and Cassandra Windsor, who is our Senior Economist at CEDA here in Western Australia, have joined me. So I think maybe we could start, Elizabeth, by asking you perhaps to just give us a bit of an overview of the early childhood care system that we have in Australia today.
Sure. Well, as Jay's alluded to, we have a very complex early childhood care system that's evolved in quite a haphazard and quite unsystematic way over the decades. So it includes formal, regulated and subsidised services that people will be familiar with, such as long day care, family daycare and preschools. And they run alongside a range of informal arrangements, such as grandparent care, which of course is the most popular form of care after parents, but also babysitters, nannies and sometimes au pairs. And that's in combination with parents, of course, whose care is in part moderated by workforce policy settings, such as paid parental leave, carers leave and flexible working options. I think we often forget to include these policies in our conversations about the early childhood system, but they are critical parts of the social infrastructure that support, or don't, parents' capacity to work and care in the way that best suits them and their child. And those services all together are in turn shaped by a really wide range of laws, policies, regulations and funding arrangements across federal and state levels that make for a very complex system that not only, as I say, involves state, federal and local government, but also the private sector and non-government organisations. So navigating the intersection between all these parts of the system is really tricky for stakeholders and often does, as Jay said earlier, lead to suboptimal outcomes for children, parents, the workforce and providers.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Gervase, maybe I could turn to you now, because we heard from Jay and also Molly in her TED talk about the importance of early childhood education in allowing brain development. But what other evidence is there about the lifelong benefits to children of starting their formal education really early? And maybe at the same time you might tell us a little bit about your work at the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth.
It's a mouthful. We generally cut it to a racy.
A racy? I thought if I say a racy, someone might thought I was being a bit a racy or something, so I was a bit worried.
Look, there is and has been a growing body of evidence around the value and impact of early childhood education, and it's mixed in its strength and things, but overall, in particular, it has a very profound effect on some factors in children and their long-term future. So in particular, things around development of cognition and language are heavily impacted, and the evidence around that is really strong, as well as academic development. And those clearly have lifelong impacts and really important lifelong impacts. There is some evidence, but it's a bit more mixed around social and emotional development. Things like self-regulation and things which again have huge impacts in lifelong life course. But that evidence is a little more mixed. But basically, it's not as simple as that. It obviously depends on what you're talking about with early childhood education. So it depends on the quality and the quantity of that education and the participation in that early childhood education. And it does, the research looks at, disadvantaged versus broader groups. And fortunately, it probably doesn't bring disadvantaged groups up to the same level as non-disadvantaged, but it brings all groups up. So it has a really important impact. So that's really, I suppose, from a summary of where the evidence sits. ARACE is an interesting organisation. Jay and I were talking about it earlier, and we've been around for about 20 years now. We were set up with the vision of Professor Fiona Stanley, and Fiona's really idea was that we needed to bring together people and evidence and knowledge and start trying to change things through that combination. And change things through influencing decision-making, building capacity, and sort of changing the sort of conversation really out there. And we've done that really over the years by partnerships. On our own, ARACE is pretty meaningless, I'd have to say. We're a group that brings together people and builds partnership with other organisations. And those partnerships include philanthropic groups like Minderoo, and we've developed a great partnership with Jay's and his team, with government at all levels, and that's, I think, really important. And Jay talked about, state and federal, but even local government have a key role in some of the things that we're trying to achieve. In private enterprise, and these partnerships are what sort of makes us, I think, be able to bring something valuable to the table.
Thank you. I mean, you and Elizabeth, you've both been involved in this area for a very long time, and you just heard from Jay, the time is now. Do you think the conversation is changing? Elizabeth, what do you see?
Yeah, I think the conversation has changed. Since I first began work in the area of early childhood policy in the early 2000s, the conversation was quite siloed. There were the kind of practitioners, there were the child health people, and there were a few policy wonks on the side, mostly from kind of community and social inclusion kind of backgrounds. And then we saw James Heckman's work around the economics of early childhood development begin to develop a concerted argument around the need for investment in the early years and the implications, the positive benefit that had for human capital formation. So by about the 2006-07, the economic case for investment in the early years was quite strong and was beginning to be taken to governments. But I think what I find really exciting is that now we've moved from those days to a position where we have enormous consensus around the need for, the purpose of, the benefits of much larger scale investment and a more comprehensive approach to the early years. So I think in many ways, attention is now on the cost of not investing in early childhood education and care rather than just making the case. So we're trying to raise the political cost of not acting in this space rather than just trying to convince people to act. And as Jay said earlier, you know, the pandemic has really, these issues were alive before the pandemic, but the pandemic has really added urgency. And we've just seen this coalition and consensus build, and Thrive by Five is a fantastic example. There are others. And I think the final thing that I'm finding exciting is that the consensus is now global. So we've seen extraordinary outlays in one of the first COVID budgets in Canada, $30 billion over 5 years with an extra $10 billion per year after that of investment in a national Canadian system. We've got Joe Biden, who's made universal access to early childhood education and care a key platform of his Building Back Better plan. So I think, you know, there's a lot of change and there is a really strong sense of urgency in the moment. We've got the evidence. We know why it's important. We know what the benefits are. It's just about developing and kind of feeding that political will.
Yeah, I won't add much to that. I think Elizabeth's put it really well, but I think a really good example of that was early years summit that Gervase co-hosted in March of last year. And just before the things shut down, and we were sort of literally, I think, days before borders closed. And although I wasn't able to attend that, the feedback from that summit was remarkable, and I think it reflected what Elizabeth was talking about consensus. I think everyone who I spoke to went to that summit was, I think, excited by the fact that everyone was on the same page and that there was this momentum and that there's interest in all sectors. And it's this sort of cry that, you know, it's everybody's business. You know, it's no longer an issue that, you know, just the non-for-profit are talking about. Philanthropy's involved, government's involved, industry's involved. And, you know, there is a really strong interest in childhood wellbeing and its ongoing impact, lifelong impact, and its economic impact.
Now, I've got a question from the audience which has been very highly voted on that I want to pose to you. This is a CEDA audience, so we always follow the money in CEDA. You see that a lot. And we've already heard from you about costs, you know, and the investments that are made and so forth. And I must say I am very grateful to Professor Alison Preston from the UWA Business School, who's in the room today, for reminding me that when you start talking about labour shortages, a very good thing to admire is whether it is actually a labour shortage or perhaps it is a wage shortage. And that is the question that's being posed to us. Childcare and early childhood workers are some of the lowest paid. How should the workforce environment need to be changed to ensure high quality care for our future generations? Cass, maybe you would have some thoughts on that, and then Joe might come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge issue, and an issue not just affecting childcare, but really all of our caring economy. So we see similar issues in aged care and disability, and how we really value these workers who are absolutely key to our society and to our economy. And the policies of further pushing childcare subsidies and expanding early childcare education have fantastic benefits, but they will require a lot of staff. And if we want to attract people to work in these sectors, we'll have to make sure that they've got strong career pathways, that they are well paid, and that they, you know, are having these kind of satisfying working careers as well. So when we talk about workforce participation, it's not just that childcare kind of frees up women to work in the workforce, but also, it creates jobs for people in the sector. But without strong wages and conditions, we won't be able to get those people. And if we want high quality care, we want high quality people working in those jobs. So that does come with a cost. This is all going to come with a cost. But I think the economics are fairly well developed now, that we know that the costs of expanding these things will actually pay off in terms of increases to GDP and long-run economic growth. But we do need to be prepared to invest in the staff working in these systems so that they can provide the quality of care and we can get these fantastic outcomes that we all want.
Yeah, Jay, where do you see this?
Yeah, you can't separate out quality from the value you place on the workforce. And the value is in lots of ways. What do you pay them, of course? But it's not just that. I mean, when you speak to the early educators, they also want the professional space to practice what they've learned. And if they don't have that space to actually, because there's just not the time and they don't have the sort of conditions, the holidays, the space to actually to actually apply what they know. If it is just juggling and sort of crowd management, that's going to be deeply distressing and devaluing. So nobody got involved in the early years just to make themselves rich. I think the wages are, but that could sort of, it's almost like it adds insult to injury. Like if you're actually run off your feet, you can't engage properly in the process and you're underpaid, it's sort of almost the straw that broke the camel's back. So I think all those things need to be addressed. And some good operations do this. Some good not-for-profits actually manage to pay decent wages, actually manage good ratios, manage to give their staff extra holidays, and they still manage to do it inside a sort of a fee structure which is affordable for parents. So it is possible. And then they're the sort of centres you see big long-term commitments of those staff members. So staff members that have 10, 11, 12, 13, 15 years of experience. And of course that means the relationship, and critically important is the relationship question, making sure that the children have this relationship. And so high turnover is the enemy of those relationship building, is of course the enemy of quality.
We've had a related question. You've talked there about the sort of structuring of childcare and, the amount of time that people get to spend in these turnover issues. And someone has asked the question of whether school hours should be restructured. Is that something that we should consider? And made the comment that the day end of 3 o'clock seems to be related to kids being able to go home to the family farm to bring the cows in, or do some other harvest work, which is perhaps not as suited to today's economy as it might have been in the time when we traditionally decided to stop. I think this really strikes into not just that particular point, but a number of workplace flexibility issues that would be tied up here. Cass, I see you grabbing your microphone, so why don't we get some reflections from all of the panel on this, but starting with you.
So I think, the early childhood education and those first 5 years are very important, but it goes through, when we talk about workforce participation in particular, it's that ongoing flexibility, because you don't just send the kids off to school, when they turn 5 and don't kind of see them again. That's when it can actually get really difficult for parents, because it's actually patching together bits of care here and there, and particularly with school hours. So I think when we want to get all the benefits from these sorts of policies about investing in this early childhood, and also making sure that we have that flexibility for parents, we need to look at a number of issues as well. And that comes down to workplace flexibility as well. And also, the role of businesses is really important here. They will want to attract a diverse and talented workforce. we've got skill shortages at the moment, we're kind of crying out for people. Well, one of the ways that we can address some of those skill shortages is to make sure that we're making the most of the people that we do have. And so if we look at policies that increase access to childcare, whether that's before school age or assisting while kids are at school, that helps the economy, that helps businesses, and that really helps families to thrive throughout that process.
Thanks, Cass. Other comments? Gervase?
I'd like to reinforce the flexibility thing. I think COVID's taught us a few good lessons, and one of them is that we can be a lot more flexible about our workplace practices. And certainly in my day job with Notre Dame University, we've found in my school that many of our staff are now working very different hours, and many from home, and in ways that are more family friendly for them and what works for them. Now their productivity hasn't gone down. If anything, from the evidence I can see, it's gone up. So I think the flexibility's got to be from all angles, rather than just, let's expand school hours. I'm always a little bit wary about that. My kids were always knackered at primary school. A longer day of primary school would have been pretty disastrous, I think, if we did that. But that doesn't mean you can't have a longer day that's not school hours. It just needs that flexibility of, well, what suits that family, that child, that community, to ensure that you'd be delivering the best options.
I think what COVID told us is that schools do two things and childcare does two things. They both care and they also provide education. And it's a bit weird, though, that for one of those systems, we think that might be done in two separate places. Somehow we care for kids while parents are at work in one place, and they learn somewhere else. Whereas at school, we sort of treat those two things as the same. And that was really powerfully organised for our minds when all those kids were at home and they were under our feet while we were trying to work. And so we suddenly realised, school does this other thing, which we'd forgotten. So, I think when you actually realise that the two systems do two things, they're challenges because there's a bit of tension, as you say, Gervase, there's a tension between what's good for the child and what might be good for the parents in terms of their workforce participation. So you have to balance those two things. But any good system, I think, has to answer both of those questions.
Elizabeth, it strikes me that as we talk about this, we could answer some questions that we've had from the audience about the role of men. Because we've heard a lot about the gender differential impact of COVID, and now we're hearing about, caring for the child and flexible working arrangements, because it will then all come together in a more open way of engaging families with work and so forth. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we do engage men, how we normalise paid parental leave for men, how do we normalise shared care. I know you've had some thoughts about this, so I'd love to hear them.
Thanks, Diane. Look, I think in order to normalise care as everyone's responsibility and to get men on board and accessing even policies that do exist and developing better ones, we really need to think carefully about policy design. As many people in your audience know, Australia's national policy settings still talk about primary and secondary carers, which is not a very subtle code for mothers and fathers. And they have different amounts of paid parental leave attached to them. And in terms of the national system, they're paid at a minimum wage. So that's something, the language and the framework of our policies really needs to change very urgently. We need a policy architecture that allows for and incentivises shared care. And that might include bonus weeks or even months where care is shared. And we've seen, a number of European economies have moved in that direction. They're continuing to move quickly in that direction. So Finland and Sweden, for example, have very long periods of shared parental leave policy as part of their offering. And we know that this is important not only in terms of getting men to contribute in the care, but it also changes what's going on in the paid workforce. So if you've got both parents being worker carers and not just worker or just carer, then you actually really shift the gender division of labour at home and in the workplace. And this has enormous benefits for women, the potential for women's economic security, for career development, for promotion, and for moving up through the pipeline and taking on really senior leadership roles. So I think, as Jay said earlier, our early years infrastructure is a really key gender equality measure. In order to meet the targets, meet the quotas, have the diverse workforces that we want, to deploy the extremely well-educated female Australian workforce, ranked #1 in the world, in order to get us up higher on the economic participations, we need to have shared care expectations, both at home and in the workforce. And we certainly know from our research that young men with children are actually converging with young women with children in terms of their attitudes and expectations around what future success at work looks like. And it's dependent on equal relationships at home and access to care policies in the workplace. So we really need to kind of work on that, change the language. We also need to increase the levels at which it's paid. Men aren't silly. They observe the motherhood penalty in action. And until that's obliterated, I can't imagine many men feeling either the incentivised, certainly not, or even the capacity to shift across and take those caring options, because, as also was said earlier, Australian households require 2 incomes. And the possibility at a time of peak care to shift down in terms of your income and be reduced to pay parental leave on the minimum wage, it's just not a possibility. And so at that point, households make very strategic decisions, and in Australia's case, it ends up locking us into the old, not stereotype, it's actually a fact, of men being primary carers and women, primary earners and women being primary carers. So there's a lot that needs to change in our policy design.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Look, I am very alert to the fact that we do have 2 secondary carers sitting here just on my left-hand side. Neither of whom, I think, are silly men. So I'd be interested in your reflection on that whole issue about men's role and normalisation and so forth. So as a secondary carer, what do you think?
My wife will confirm I'm definitely a secondary. I'll be lucky to be, might be a tertiary carer. Look, I've been lucky to work in often female-dominated areas. In my clinical work in paediatrics, I've worked with more female colleagues than male. And so I've seen, I suppose, the juggle of actually what's often been primary earner and primary carer roles by some of my colleagues. I have seen a shift, certainly I think in the last 10 years, which I think has been really healthy. I've got male staff who are actively taking parental leave and are clearly shared carers in their children's upbringing, a lot more than I was with my children. And I think we are seeing that shift. I would agree with Elizabeth, we need to incentivise it a bit more. It can't just be out of progressive thinking and goodness of certain individuals. So I think we do need to do it. But I think, Elizabeth mentioned a number of issues, but, one of the ones that has given me great concern is the pay gap, but it's also the super gap. And, that's one of the things that, breaks for children has had a major impact on women, and I think we've got to address those things very actively. So I'm very supportive of it. I recognise me preaching it is always a bit dangerous because I'm one of the dinosaurs.
Yeah, lots of guilt rushing through my body at this point. But I remember my wife was interviewed about, like as they do, these sort of, human interest stories, and the journalist asked her, your husband said that, because we had young kids at the time, he's a bit of a hands-on dad. And she said, did he? That's nice if he said that. But anyway, so no, probably wasn't as present as I should have been. But one thing I have observed, at least once again from my wife's workplace, she talks about these young men that are actually demanding much more workplace flexibility than she would have felt brave enough to ask for. And she's sort of mildly resentful at the fact that they're actually saying, oh, I'm shooting through to pick up the kids now, which of course she accommodates. But she thought, God, I would never have been game enough to do that. So men, I think young men are, beginning, and of course it's men that miss out because it's
Exactly.
a beautiful time of life. And so I think once it becomes a norm and men see other men doing this, obviously they're not going to suffer a big financial penalty. So you do need to address that question, but it becomes a sort of new social norm. You'll start to see behaviour change, I imagine.
Well, unfortunately, we are coming very close to the end of our time. And there is one question that I just would like perhaps, Jay, to give you the last word on. It comes from Ronnie Alexander, who's in the room here, who works in WA Police with vulnerable children. And she's asked how we better support parents to keep their children safe, and particularly with the angle that children who come from unsafe environments can't flourish if they can't engage in learning opportunities. And I do think we sometimes get this pushback that, well, isn't this all about only vulnerable children? And if we put in a wonderful universal access system, will we perhaps just be displacing a whole lot of privately funded? I think you understand where that question is going from me, about how we do think about the fact that we have got some very good outcomes for some cohorts of people, but not so great for others.
Yeah, I mean, the great irony of, if you think about the childcare system as being sort of like infant maternal health, and then at the other end you've got preschool, the big hole in the middle is childcare. Because childcare wasn't really designed to be part of the child development system. It was really designed as an instrument of employment policy. So it's not really designed for disadvantaged families. They can access it, but the rules are tough, and if you're a single mum or you've got a chaotic family and you've got a sort of somewhat disconnected relationship to the world of work, accessing a childcare centre, which is not really going to look like the sort of place that's made for you, is not actually much of an option. And the great irony is that early learning opportunity and maybe some of the parenting support around it is more needed by those families than it is by the families that are perhaps in more secure employment. So I think if you create, protecting children is about making sure that they're visible. The way you make children visible is you make sure that there are eyes on those families. And the way you do that is to have a universal, high-quality early childhood system. And that's what we're campaigning for, and that's why you should go to thriveby5.org.au and sign up and join the campaign.
Thank you. I knew we would get to the advertisement at some point, thriveby5.org.au. We will have to leave it there, and apologies to those whose questions that I didn't get to. I'm now going to ask Amy Stanley, who's a member of the leadership team at HBF Health, private health insurer here in Western Australia, to come to the podium and give us a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to have been able to attend today and to be part of the proceedings. I am sure, like me, there are a number of points today that really resonated with you, and it will prompt you to seek change or ask yourself, what can I do to make a difference to ensure children, all our children, get the best start in life? As a mother of 2 young boys, I really understand the struggle of balancing an executive career with being a mother. And I've been in the fortunate position that I do have a mother and a mother-in-law who have been very active in helping me to raise my children. And I'm often asked by younger females, what's your big lesson in life, Amy, and how have you developed your career? And my answer always is, choose the right partner. I have been very fortunate that my husband has been a very supportive partner in every single way. He took 2 significant periods of paid parental leave to support my 2 boys, and you can really see the difference in the relationship that he has with them both today. So certainly that is my one lesson to all you young females out there: choose that right partner. I've also been very lucky to work for companies who have allowed me the flexibility to raise my children, but also to hold senior roles, including now at HBF. And like so many other businesses, our operations last year were impacted by COVID-19, which caused the closure of our branches and forced us to send our 1,000 employees to work from home. Despite these continued disruptions, we found that we too improved our member contact experience across all our channels, and we also saw an improvement in employee productivity and engagement. And this has forced us to think about our approach to flexibility ongoing. When the lockdown came to an end in WA, we started to introduce a staged return to our head office, but we heard loud and clear from our people that they wanted the continued flexibility, be that the ability to work from home 1 or 2 days a week or staggered hours, but it was there, and so we've continued to offer this to our people. We've found that our people like it and value it, but we also understand now we need to remain competitive, and this is what talent is demanding from their employers. While these measures and attitudes help those with parenting and caring responsibilities, it is only one part of the solution to improving female workforce participation and empowering women in the workplace. With a collective effort, I believe we can make a difference on growing minds and our economy, and on a grand scale. And yes, the time is now. Please join me in thanking Mr. J. Weatherill, Professor Elizabeth Hill, Professor Gervase Chaney, Ms. Diane Smith-Gander and Ms. Cassandra Windsor for their time and contribution this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Amy. So it's just now to me to thank everyone for attending today, either in the room or on the live stream, and to particularly thank Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5. Not just for today's event, of course, but for the incredibly important work that they are doing and the incredibly important work you're going to continue doing and the success you're going to have. I think it's amazing that we've got someone with your skill and experience, but ability to understand the system and navigate through it. So I think that's what we're expecting to see, Jay. Thanks very much for your participation through the Pigeonhole app. There is one job for you yet to do in Pigeonhole, and that is please to go in and give us some feedback on this event. We hear a lot about COVID pivoting and COVID changes, and of course this is very different for us having hybrid live stream events, and so we'd like to hear how it has worked for you. And please stay in touch with this conversation and upcoming conversations via our website, ceda.com.au. You can also register there for a couple of upcoming events that we have here in WA. On the 29th of October, we will hear from Deputy Premier, the Honourable Roger Cook, on More Than Mining, Future-Proofing WA's Economy. And given that he is also the Minister for Health, I'm sure you can sneak in a few COVID questions, a few border opening questions, and a few other pointed questions about vaccination. So I'll leave you to do that for us if you don't mind. Then a little bit later on the 18th of November, Lucy Ellis, who is the Deputy Governor Economics of the Reserve Bank Australia, will be coming to the CEDA stage. And then the biggie that always happens once a year in December will be State of the State with the Premier, Treasurer and Minister for just about everything else, the Honourable Mark McGowan. Now, any of you that were lucky enough to be in the room for that one last year with 900 of your West Australian mates in the Crown Ballroom will remember Carolyn Chan from Westpac asking the Tiger Mum question, because the Premier's rating was approval rating was 86%, and she congratulated him on and then said, well, I am a Tiger mother, where's the other 14%? And it is still one of my most memorable moments, the look on the Premier's face when he tried to work out how to tell this very serious woman in an amazing pair of, were they Manolos or Jimmy Choos? Or Lubies, they were Lubies, I knew they were Lubies. Exactly what was going on. So she's the one woman in WA that can challenge Julie Bishop on the shoe front. So with that, Cassandra, you're very boring today. Normally she has the most amazing shoes. Let me thank our panellists again and bring today's event to a close. Thank you, everybody.